Sure. Yeah, my name is Raphael Van Lierop, and I'm the creative director at Helm Studio. It's all of them. Yeah, it's all of them. What I talked about in my speech today, or my talk today, was really about the issue that we have in our industry right now around blockbuster games, and how the business model is really making it hard for games that are new, original IPs, or trying to offer a different experience to kind of break through, and that the economics of the industry don't encourage that kind of experimentation, and publishers are unfortunately not in a position to take a lot of risks because the games are so expensive. So what I talk about there is what I call a mid-core blockbuster, or is like a small big game, essentially, that it still has the production values of a high-quality blockbuster game. And I kind of define a blockbuster in a very specific way, that it's a game that really pushes kind of the visceral aspect of the game. It's an experience, so it feels like you're going somewhere, and it's an escapist fantasy, and it's also a narrative experience. So you usually are taking on a role of a character, or at least you're in a very specific world, and there's a strong narrative component to it. And it tends to be action games, so that's kind of how I define that blockbuster. And so, yeah, I mean, a small big game or a mid-core blockbuster would be a game that has, I define it as a game that's 4 to 6 hours of gameplay. It's probably $20 or $30. It's still presenting high production quality, but potentially, because it's a lower cost, has an opportunity to innovate in some ways that the big sort of established franchises are not able to. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that Katamari would fit into the definition that I'm using of blockbuster, but an example of a game that is coming out that I think fits in well, and it's really hard to currently find examples of games that fit in this description because there aren't very many of them. There's a lot of really good, successful independent games out there that are around that price point that have been really successful, but I'm not really talking about the success of the game to define blockbuster. I'm talking about the experience of the game to define blockbuster. And an example of one that's coming out that I think is really promising is I'm Alive, the Ubisoft game that's coming out, that's going to be downloadable. And it feels to me like and I haven't played it, but when you look at it, it feels very much like a blockbuster experience. There's a lot of high production quality. It's a very visceral experience. You play a character in this quite, epic experience, but again, it's a downloadable game with a lower price point, and I don't know how much gameplay there is, but that's an example, I think, of a game that fits within that mold. I don't think we're headed for a crash like the 80s, partly because we do have some, digital is starting to grow in its importance. So we do have an alternate business model that's out there. I think definitely we're seeing a lot of sequeling and stuff that's happening right now, and franchises that are getting burned out by publishers because they release too often, they don't innovate enough in between, and gamers are just getting tired of it. So that's something that we need to be careful of. I think the industry will be fine because there's huge growth happening in other areas that will kind of sustain it. But I do think that what I call the mid-core blockbuster, or the small big game, is a great opportunity to address an area of the market that isn't really served right now. And I think there's a lot of potential, and I think you can see the trends in the sales figures and as I say in my talk, where the pricing kind of settles in, and once a game has been in the market for a little while, around $30, that tells us that it's an interesting price point that people feel is like a good value proposition for them, and maybe they're willing to take more risks on a product that they don't know very well, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if we're not careful, and we don't find it, we really need to find a way to encourage experimentation more than what we can right now. And I think, it's the fear and the risk, the lack of, the risk aversion, both on the part of publishers and developers and gamers. I mean, there are lots of examples of games that have been developed where people tried to do something a little bit different, and they weren't rewarded for it. They weren't, gamers they didn't reward it with their money. And I think that's really unfortunate, because you do hear a lot of people say, well, all the games are the same and I want to have new experiences, but then you put new experiences out and it doesn't always succeed. So there's a lot of sort of mechanisms in place with the business model and the player tastes, and that $60 price point I think is a huge problem for us right now. And I think, again, creating, I think there's got to be something between the huge blockbuster games and the casual social games. There's got to be an opportunity in the middle, and I think the blockbuster game serves an important role outside of just being a genre of game. I think it has a content and delivers an experience that is very specific and important to gamers and to society in a way. Yeah, I mean, I feel when I talk about a mid-core blockbuster, I still think of it as a very high-quality game that is not flawed. I agree with you that I think there's a people are more forgiving of a game that costs less, but I don't think that shouldn't be an excuse for us to make lesser quality games. Obviously, right? I think what you were saying about the average age for gamers is higher than you might think, right? And a lot of people like myself are in their mid-30s, and I have a family and all these commitments like you've been discussing. I do think that's a barrier to entry, and sure, we might have the means to drop $60 on every game that's out there if we want, but it's hard to validate that. It's hard to justify doing that when you're probably not going to ever get it done. So I do feel like if we could bring the length of sort of the commitment that we're asking people to make to have a complete experience, that could have a very positive impact. You've probably seen statistics about how few people actually finish the games that they start. That's a crazy problem for us to have. Think about all the money that we spend in the industry to make these huge games, and very few people even finish them. And it's sort of like this the dynamic that's in place when you go to a movie theater where you've paid your money up front and you sit down and it's only 2 hours. So even if it's not that great, you're probably going to sit through the whole thing anyway. With a game, it's so easy to say, hey, the first 15 minutes or whatever was kind of boring. I'm not going to continue. But because I'm not sure I'm going to have 4 hours of fun, I'm not going to spend the $60. I'm going to go rent it instead, or I'm going to buy a pre-owned copy. So there's a whole bunch of dynamics that are in place around the pricing and the retail model and all this kind of stuff that really encourages a lot of what I consider to be negative kind of dynamics around player choice and purchasing decisions and things like that. So I do think if games could come down in price, that would help a lot, but then consequently they have to cost less to make, and the easiest way that I can think of to make them cost less to make is to make smaller games, essentially. Because as I say in my talk, like the bulk of a project budget is in production, where all the content is getting made. You're still going through your concept development phase, you're still going through pre-production to prove things work, and then the lion's share, like 75% of your budget, is basically coming from making the content. And I think if you can make less content, is a way to find a better, like a healthier balance in the pricing and the revenue. I mean, I would like to think that it can all help, right? I think if, in combination, and I spend a lot of time in my talk talking about like the digital model and how important that is to making this transition. And I think so many of the problems that exist right now in the industry and the economics of it is driven by the box product retail side of the industry. So if we can, as we move away from that, and it's going to happen, it's happening already, it will be possible to make games for less money, smaller budgets, which means the chances of being profitable are greater, which means more studios will find themselves in a position where they can survive the thing that you just described. It doesn't mean you can get away with making worse games. It just means that sometimes there will be situations where a studio might have been closed if it had been the situation you described with your friends at their studio. They have an opportunity to exist. And then things like the ongoing monetization, like free to play or microtransactions or whatever, that bring in sort of more of a drip feed of funding instead of it only coming at the end of the project or whatnot. That's an interesting possibility as well. And there's a lot of studios and games right now that are using that model that are finding it really successful. So I think that's pretty exciting for us. Yeah, I mean, like right now, it doesn't feel like the consoles are the right place, just because they don't really feel like they're like it's not a hardware issue as much as it is kind of a marketplace issue. I think that the things like Xbox Live and PSN, even to some degree, they kind of perpetuate like a lot of the same issues that exist in the physical retail, because you can't find things very easily, and whether your game is successful can often depend on how heavily they choose to promote it and how like visible you are. And I mean, look at even better examples like the App Store for iOS games, where it's very hard to find things there. And unless you're one of the top sort of 25 that gets pulled up in those searches, your chances of being noticed are pretty minimal. And so those things are perpetuating a lot of the same problems. I think if we can fix those things, then a lot of those other issues go away, and then any platform that's using digital essentially could be viable. I think Steam is a great platform. I think that there's nothing about the consoles themselves that prevent digital from being the right model. It's just that right now the stores don't feel like they're set up that way.